welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of many books, but of one particular book that's coming out very shortly. It will be out actually when you hear this, a book that absolutely took my breath away. It is intimate, it is epic, it is really, really moving and beautiful, and I am so excited for this conversation. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yes, of course. My name is Susan Wiggs, and as you mentioned, thank you very much. I'm the author of many books, but this Wayward Girls, which is coming out in July, is probably my edgiest, most daring, and probably most emotional book that I've ever written. And we're talking about many books and lots of laughter and tears through the years. My first book came out in 1987, before any of you were born, and I published more or less a book every year. And so, but Wayward Girls is a little bit of a turn for me. Most of my books are I've written historical romance, I've written contemporary romance, I've written just general fiction that's very woman-centered, all the loves that fill a woman's life. And I was struck a couple of years ago by a really kind of strange, obscure historical situation that sort of threw me for a loop, that took place in the 1960s and all over the US, but the most extreme form, they were these girls' reform schools, basically. The most extreme one was in Buffalo, New York. And I felt sort of connected to that because I lived there. I was born near Buffalo and I lived there until I was 10 years old. And after that, our family moved overseas and we never moved back. But in 2021, my brother and I went back for kind of a nostalgia trip. He was a couple years older, and just to kind of look at our old house, which happened to be on the market at the time. So we got to tour it and look at, this little town outside Buffalo where, I always thought it was kind of a magical place because I was a kid. When you're 10 years old, everything is magical about your town. We went to our church, and it's a Catholic church called St. Mary's. And we were standing outside the church. We went inside, and it's a very grand, Gothic, beautiful church. And we went in, and I wouldn't call it a recovered memory, but I had a spark. It sparked a memory of something that I thought I had forgotten many years back. I was a kid, and it was that my brother was an altar boy for about 5 minutes because we, quickly moved overseas after that. But he was an altar boy, and I remember he was wearing the red cassock with the white underneath it, and he was called the thurifer. And that's the guy, if you're not Catholic, you carry something called the thurible, and it swings on a chain, and there's incense and coals in there. And at high mass, you proceed everybody down the aisle and you incense the whole church. Don't ask me why. I wasn't very good in catechism. But at some point during that process, his sleeve caught on fire. And I don't know. I think and I didn't really remember much after that. But it was such a specific memory that I kind of went down a rabbit hole, as writers and researchers and historians do. I kind of went down a rabbit hole about, what was the Catholic Church like for people in the 60s, and the late 60s, early 70s is when the book takes place, most of the book. And there were some surprises, not always really welcome surprises awaiting me there. And another piece of this is that I was aware, as a lot of people are, of the system in Ireland known as the mother and baby homes. They're called Magdalen laundries. They're workhouses. They're places where they would send unmarried girls who were pregnant to have their babies. And they were called laundries because that was the work that they did. They had to work for a living, and they were horrible conditions. And it's quite scandalous in Ireland. What I didn't know and what I found out is that these Magdalen laundries were pervasive in the US. There were at least 38 that I found, and one of the worst ones was in Buffalo, New York. And so couple that with our nostalgia tour, and we went to the actual physical location of it. You can go see it still. It's 485 Best Street in Buffalo. I put it up on my Instagram feed. So if you look at my Instagram feed, there's a little video clip. We couldn't go in because now it's actually a boys' Muslim school, but at the time, but it still has the razor wire, it has the walls, it has the big blocky, Gothic buildings. It's a real creepy, scary place with a real weird energy. And so, as a writer does, you kind of put all these together. And then the other thing that I did is, and I have a love-hate relationship with the internet, as we all do. I love it for the convenience and the connections and things like that, and I hate it for all the misinformation and the rabbit holes and the wrong turns you can take. But I found, and you'll appreciate this, I found an ally who was a librarian. She's the librarian of the Buffalo History Museum, and she sort of pointed me in all the right directions. And then the other thing that to research this situation, and the other thing that I found in my, pre-writing process was like a lot of Facebook, not a lot, a Facebook group. It was called Buffalo, and it's just people in and around Buffalo, or people who were in Buffalo, who were. It's sort of a nostalgia group for mid-century Buffalo, basically mid 20th century Buffalo. And I posted a picture of 485 Best Street, the facility there. It covers an entire city block. It's really big. And I said, does anybody have any stories about this, any memories about this? And I got 500 replies. And I started saving them and having like side conversations with the people who, a lot of them were like, oh, my mother used to threaten to send me to the nuns. And, that's where the bad girls went. And there were a lot of really specific things. And I thought, God, there's a book here. And so that was the little kernel. And then the other hurdle for me, because I'm a commercial writer, meaning my books are supposed to sell and sell in a big way. And, thank goodness they have for the past 35 whatever years. You have to kind of sell your idea to your publisher. And so my publisher was used to beach books and books that take place in Sonoma or the south of France, or, these aspirational, um, um, sweep me away books. And so I was a little apprehensive when I pitched this, because I said, here's what I'm seeing. And I was very lucky. I have a really creative, excellent editor. In fact, she even like wrote a special memo to the early readers just to kind of prep them for this book, because she was so excited about it. So I got the green light. That's not always the case. Sometimes they think, you kind of get shot down. That doesn't sound like anything we'd want to publish from you, or something like that. And that was what I expected to hear, but indeed I did not. They said, go for it and good luck with that. So for the next like year and a half to 2 years, I was just wailing away at Wayward Girls. And so here we are. And I'm so excited. For me, this was a long time coming. Some writers take years and years and years to write their books. I don't, because like I said, I'm a commercial writer. I've got to make a living. So here we are. And Wayward Girls is in stores as a summer read. I'm very curious to see what reader reaction will be. But thank you. So yeah, there's my long-winded intro to the book.
Beautiful. It's absolutely perfect. And I have so many questions. Yeah, it really is. Just the history alone stunned me because, as you said, I was aware of the Magdalene laundries operating overseas, but had no idea that it was here and so close to home to us in New York. Um, so could you tell us a little bit about um, the Good Shepherd, the Home for Wayward Girls, and the girls that we meet? I'm really curious about crafting their characters and if there was one who was the easiest to crack and one that was the toughest to crack in terms of, yeah, character, voice, all that kind of stuff.
Yes. Well, another thing that drew me to this idea was the fact that there's always a main character, and her name is Marin O'Hara. O'Hara is the name of actually one woman who is currently in a lawsuit. She's in her 70s now. She was incarcerated there, in the 60s, and very awfully, horribly abused there. And so I kind of Tuckerized her name, but I wanted an Irish name because the genesis of these institutions was from France and Ireland. So anyway, yeah, so Marin is the main character, but one of the things that drew me to the story was that it could be an ensemble cast. I always love people of diverse backgrounds who are brought together, in this case, against their will, not willingly. And I love people trapped in a train station or snowed in somewhere or something like that. I always love those because it's a way to throw together people who are really different from each other, which you don't always encounter in real life. And so I was drawn to that. And so I started with Marin, and she has a really sad and common situation. Her mom is an Irish immigrant with a backstory of her own I won't go into. And Mom was widowed. And in the 60s, even in the 60s, when you were a very traditional Catholic woman, especially from Ireland, the minute you're widowed, you start looking for a man. And so the next husband that she found, Marin's stepdad, went the way of stepdads, as she was a budding teenager of 15. Suddenly, he's turned very creepy. And her older brother, who has been kind of the wedge between them and kind of her protector, gets drafted. Because what happened in 1968? The draft. And so she's suddenly, her brother's going away. Stepdad is creepy. Mom stays loyal to stepdad because that's what women did. And so she is sent to the Good Shepherd for a reason that is actually really common. They called them temptresses. That was the term that they had. And it was to get a young girl away from a man's worst impulses. So instead of focusing, because it was a patriarchy, still is, sadly, but the man sort of went about his business, and in order to protect the girl, she was, parked in this institution at the age of 15. And, she's like a deer in the headlights. Once there, she discovers other reason. Women were sent there if they had unplanned pregnancies, teenage girls. They were sent there if they, I don't want if the foster care system failed them. And in fact, the county judges would assign women to be sent there because the nuns had them convinced that this was a safe environment where they would complete their education. There was very little education that went on there, but that was the ruse that they used. So sometimes kids who were in the foster kid there, there's a character in my book who was neurodivergent. They didn't have that term back then. I mean, they basically, I'm going to be very incorrect, but I don't know, there was a bully. There's always a bully in a group like that, and the bully just called her, Kay the retard. That was how they termed it. There was a young girl whose parents, because the other thing that was happening in the world besides the Vietnam War and the 60s here, I'm going to say it wrong, Mao Zedong, I don't know. He was emerging, in China, and there was a very anti-intellectual movement. And there's a girl whose parents were Chinese intellectuals, and they had to go back to China, they thought, for a temporary trip, and it ended up stretching into years because they were detained. And they just parked her here because they thought it was a good place for their daughter to stay while they were out of town. And so we have her. She's very important, Helen. And then there was another thing. One of the things I love about writing and research is you come across these little incidents that sort of inform your book. I knew nothing about the race riots in 1968 Buffalo that had to be that they actually had to send Jackie Robinson, the baseball player, to calm the city. They were that bad. And so there's a girl who got swept up in that. And obviously she was not at fault. She was a 15-year-old girl, but she was a black girl. And so um, when something happened between her and a white policeman, obviously we know, who they would point the finger to. So she was there. And she actually came from a very good and loving family, but because of her race, she was incarcerated. And then there was another one with a very strict Irish grandma and Angela was probably the most near and dear to my heart, the character. She was very bookish. She loved the library. She loved books. And she actually bonded with a librarian who was a Holocaust survivor. And this librarian just kind of changed her life because it wasn't spoken of in the 60s when people were gay. A lot of gay people probably did not even know what was happening with them. And so this librarian gave her some books. I hadn't even heard of these books, but it was a series of books. Bebo, can't remember, Bebo, something. Now I can't even remember. I got it right in the book. Anyway, it's a series of kind of cool adventure books by a gay girl, and they were pulp fiction in the 50s. And this librarian just gave them to Angela, and she went, "Oh my God." She figured out herself and she saw herself in a book, which I think is so powerful. So there's a girl like that. But of course, her very traditional grandma sends her to the nuns to get reformed because that's what people thought was to be done about a girl who liked girls.
Mm.
So, and she's a very key character. The other thing that really drew me to this is that I could follow these girls from the start of the book when they all find themselves in this institution, the Good Shepherd, until they're now in their 70s and it's present day. And the reason I did that is that New York created a few years ago, they created, it was called a look back law. And it meant that you could take legal action against abuse that happened many, many years ago. They removed the statute of limitations and it kind of paved the way so that you could take legal action on your own behalf if you could prove something happened to you in these years. And so that's why it spans that. And it was just fascinating for me to kind of take them through the decades one by one. And so, yeah, so the other nugget that kind of and a couple of things during my research, they stopped Niagara Falls in 1969 in June. The don't, they had all these rationales why they did it, but the Army Corps of Engineers dried up Niagara Falls. It's such a bad idea. I mean, our government has so many bad ideas, but this one was an epic bad. They were like, let's stop Niagara Falls. There was one article that I read. They wanted to see what was under there because they thought there were too many boulders and maybe they were going to remove some and make the falls even more fallish. I don't know. It was so weird. But of course, the nuns at that time thought it was a miracle. So they took the girls on a field trip to see this miracle. And it turned out to be a real key scene. And so remember back then, we didn't have texting, we didn't have email, we didn't have anything. We had a phone book. And so they said, if we ever get separated, let's make sure we come back here every 4th of July and, meet each other again. And you can imagine how that went. I mean, it's not going to happen when you're a kid. You just, have this magical thinking. But indeed, there was a way for them in later years. And then another thing that kind of inspired me was that women were not allowed in our nation's military academies, the Naval Academy and West Point, Air Force Academy, Coast Guard, the elite ones, until 1976 was the first graduating class. And it was approved by President Ford. He signed that. And so we actually get to see one woman who was in that first graduating class. So little bits like that just brought the story to life for me, and hopefully I did it in the book.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's all. It's so interesting. And I think what's, really interesting about the girls, as you've been describing, they come from very different walks of life. They are there for very different reasons, but they have all, already been marginalized by society or in their own family lives even. And they all are, pretty much like already traumatized by the time that they arrive at the Good Shepherd. And that brings me to a question. I don't want you to reveal anything about the later stages of the book, so I'm going to try to be really broad in how I phrase this. But something that matters, later in the book is what does justice look like when you are up against an all-powerful institution like that? I was reminded of there's this line in the movie Spotlight about the Catholic Church that I always think of like when I am reading about these things, and somebody says the Catholic Church thinks in not in days, not in weeks, not in months, but in centuries. And, you know, that sort of speaks, I think, interestingly to the advantage often that these like huge institutions have when individuals are trying to go up against them. So, yeah, could you talk about how you dealt with the concept of justice and its possibility in this book?
It was really difficult because of what you said. You can't undo something that happened to you,
Mm.
but you can give it a context and you can give it meaning for the victim, the traumatized victim. A book that I did read while I was working on this book what is called What Happened to You, and it's by Dr. somebody Perry. I want to say Tyler Perry, but it's not. Dr. Perry in conversation with Oprah Winfrey. And the premise of the book is that instead of asking a traumatized person, what's wrong with you, you ask them, what happened to you? And it sounds like a subtle difference, but it's enormous in the mind of somebody. It's not your fault. It happened. And so you can't, you can heal from trauma, but you can't erase the trauma. So you have to find a way to find a context. And I'm glad you asked that because I struggled with some of the final scenes of the book because when I turned in the first draft, my editor said it needs more power. You know, it needs to, and she said, don't worry about being over the top because when a person really finally gets to speak their truth, they get to say whatever they say, you know, and so the truth telling at the end of the book is really in your face. But the reason I did that is that even though they can't undo what happened to them, they can, I think justice is served. You know, a lot of people talk about the monetary amount that people win from these cases, and the Catholic Church has already been held liable for millions and millions and millions. I mean, record-setting millions of dollars. In fact, the Diocese of Buffalo went bankrupt over these cases. There's over $100 million. Yeah, it happened earlier last year, and so there's a fund, but all the money in the world is not going to take away the harm that was done to you. What's going to take it away, I think, is being able to find your voice and speak your truth and share it. I mean, it's so important to broadcast these things. And I think one reason that it was so awful for so long is that we swept it under the rug. We didn't talk about it. We didn't even know how to talk about it. And so we're finally finding the vocabulary for that. And so I think justice looks like the characters finding their own way to express themselves and organize their lives around on their terms. And that is, I think it's a form of justice. I hope it is.
Yeah, absolutely. That does segue really nicely into my last question because everything you've been talking about speaks to the subject matter, which is very heavy for a lot of the book. You read a lot about suffering and conflict and abuse, but the book is ultimately extremely hopeful. And so I'm just curious about like as a writer, how do you achieve that balance where you are like grounded in realism, which is sometimes kind of like ugly for lack of a better word, with like that sort of hopeful spirit.
I think it all comes down to these irrepressible characters. I personally love teenagers. They drive me crazy, but I still love them. They're just, and so you can't beat down, you know, a really spirited teenager, which my girls are. And so it sounds like on the from the outside, it sounds like it might be a gloomy and depressing read because of all of the ordeals that these girls went through, but they are actually the ultimate sisterhood. They're tough, they're clever, they're courageous. Their spirit kind of shines through. There's moments of humor where you know they manage to turn on rock and roll music, which is strictly forbidden, obviously, and have dance parties in the dorm and do all those. And I just think the grace and humanity of these young girls rescues it from being this awful gulag archipelago kind of thing. And I hope readers will take that away as well, because I'm known for my feel-good fiction. This one, they had to kind of earn the feel-good ending to this book through, you know, by walking through fire.
Yeah, 100%. But you're absolutely right, I think. It is very hopeful in the end. And I think that ultimately cathartic, like for not just the characters, but for the reader. Like it's a really moving journey to go on. And so, yeah, thank you for coming in and talking about it with us and sharing the book with me.
This was such a pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thanks. Just before we go, are you writing right now? I know you can't always talk about things in process, but are you working on anything?
Always, always. And this one, I'll give you one word because it's my best friend in the world, and the word is sisters.
Hmm.
And so if I start with that, it's a topic I know lots about, and I'm eager to, put a spin on that.
Nice. Excellent. Well, happy writing. Godspeed.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, listeners, this is the part where it's your turn. Please check out Wayward Girls. By the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world. So you can go to your favorite bookstore, library, meet a cool librarian perhaps, website, wherever you like to go for your books. Okay, it is time to close this chapter. We'll see you.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.